4.
Order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Tuesday the 3rd of December 2024. Today we've got two panels in front of us looking at the work of the Financial Conduct Authority, and they will be in front of us next week. So I'm delighted to welcome first of all witnesses from the industry, and we have with us Miles Celic, who's the Chief Executive Officer of TheCityUK, so welcome to you. And can I just check, sorry I should have checked before, the pronunciation of
that's fine, thank you.
Celic, okay. And he's joined by Hannah Gurga, who's the Director General of the Association of British Insurers, often known as the ABI, and David Postings is the Chief Executive of UK Finance, and William Wright is the Managing Director of New Financial, which is and is also a former editor and member of the founding team at Financial News, a specialist publication that looked at these issues. Before we dive into our questions, and we have about an hour, so what I would say is, first of all, if one of your colleagues answers a question and you completely agree with them, you don't need to repeat it. You can just completely agree with them, and if you don't, then please stay and to wave to me if there's something you wish to add. But before we begin, I just wanted to repeat a statement made by the Deputy Speaker yesterday on behalf of the Speaker of the House about a matter that's sub judice. So just to quote what she said yesterday to the House: I understand that the Court of Appeal has recently handed down a judgment on 3 cases relating to motor finance. Since the lenders involved have sought permission to appeal those cases to the Supreme Court, they remain sub judice. Mr. Speaker is exercising his discretion to allow reference to those cases now and in future proceedings where necessary, as they concern a matter of national importance. And I'm sure our panel are fully aware of that matter of national importance. And on that matter, I'm going to turn straight away to Bobby Dean MP. Mr. Dean.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, kicking off with the Motor Finance Commission issue and the Court of Appeal decision that we've had recently, could you explain to me sort of how significant and widespread the impact of this will be on the industry? And perhaps start with you, Hannah.
Well, thank you. I'm Hannah Gurga, Director General of the ABI, and a pleasure to be before the committee today. In regard to this particular judgment by the Court of Appeal, this does not affect my members. As I understand it, the decision relates to motor dealers acting as credit brokers, and the decision is one where the court found that the credit brokers are effectively owing a disinterested duty and a fiduciary duty to their customers, and this sets a higher bar around commission disclosure than was required by the FCA at the time. I'm aware that the decision has generated a lot of interest, but my reading of the judgments suggests that it's specific to the facts of the 3 motor finance cases before the court, and as such, my sense is that it is unlikely to have a direct read across to other types of intermediated financial services. And I understand that this is also subject to permission to appeal to the Supreme Court, so the position is not going to be settled until well into 2025. So it's something that we are monitoring, but it's not a particular issue at this stage that is affecting the ABI or our members.
Others would like to provide comment on this?
Yeah, I'm David Postings, the Chief Executive of UK Finance. It does affect some of our members, but I would agree with what Hannah's just said, and we would really like to wait until the Supreme Court has looked at it to understand whether there's a read across to anything else.
I understand there's widespread conversation about this already, and we do have permission to talk about it more broadly today. Do you think there's any particular elements of financial services that could be affected if the decision was to be upheld?
It would be, I think, wrong to speculate on that. I think that the Supreme Court needs to look at the case first to understand whether there is or not. The ruling appears to be subject to different interpretations, and so I think it'd be wrong to try and speculate.
And talking about mass redress events more broadly then, what is your view and the regulation around that at the moment, and whether or not there is need for reform?
I'm not quite sure what you mean.
So there's been talk about reforming the Financial Ombudsman Service, for example, and there's been lots of speculation about whether or not mass redress events need to be handled differently. This is an example of potentially one of them, but if you could talk more broadly about mass redress events and whether or not you think that the current system of regulation is sufficient.
Difficult to talk about mass redress events specifically, but the Ombudsman Service operates with an eye to regulation, takes into account regulation and the law, but it has the powers to be fair, to use what they describe as fair and reasonable. So it can set precedents which are broader, which is, I think, one of the reasons why a review of their remit is welcome. The review that the Chancellor referred to in the Mansion House speech, I think, is very welcome.
And do you not accept that some people might see a review of these mass redress events as being watering down protections for consumers?
The Ombudsman Service provides a very useful dispute resolution service. And the caseload is quite significant and has been rising recently. There's no sense, I don't think, about watering protection down for consumers, but I think the review of what the Ombudsman Service does should help in trying to align regulation and their judgment so that it's easier for firms to know where the rules really are, because in some respects they act as a sort of regulator themselves, because they have on occasion set precedent which is difficult for firms to anticipate in advance.
Ms. Gurga, I see that you might want to come in.
Thank you. Yes, I would agree with David that we're at an interesting inflection point, really, I think, for the regulation of financial services in the UK. The government set out its growth mission. It said that's its primary mission. And we've heard very welcome words from the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and also from the Economic Secretary about the need to regulate for growth rather than regulate.
Yeah, but we're talking particularly about motor finance here. Yeah.
Well, we're talking about the Financial Ombudsman Service, and I think it's looking at this in the context of the regulatory ecosystem, because what we have is an ecosystem that has evolved over years, and effectively you've got a ratchet system that only operates in one direction. So all parties within the ecosystem are effectively incentivised to add more regulation to that system. And each body has got a slightly different remit. And this is the challenge with the FOS. The FOS plays an important role in that ecosystem, but its remit allows it to take decisions that are broader than the Financial Conduct Authority.
Yes.
And on occasion that means that there can be challenges for the firms themselves when they get a judgment from the FOS that it is beyond what might have reasonably been respected of them by the regulator at the time. So I agree with David. The call for input that the Chancellor announced looking at mass redress events I think is important, but it needs to be looked at in the context of the overall regulatory framework, and how can we collectively make sure that we've got the right balance within that system, so that we have got appropriate consumer protection, we have got appropriate focus on market integrity and stability, but also enabling growth and innovation.
And would you be able to add comment as well about the role of claims management companies in this as well?
Well, I think the role of claims management companies can be important for some consumers, but as the FOS itself has recently announced, it's looking to charge fees now on CMCs. And that's something that we would welcome, because we think that will hopefully lead to a reduction in the number of poor quality cases that are sent to the FOS by the CMCs. And if you look at the data, you can see that when individuals have gone directly to the FOS, they're more likely to get a judgment in their favour than if they have used a CMC. So we think that's a positive development.
If I could just add that it's free for consumers to go direct to the FOS. It's not necessarily free to go through a CMC, so it's in their interest to go direct. And I think the fact that the Ombudsman Service has now put a process in place that means they have to have explicit consumer permission to put a case forward is really positive, because it's stopping egregious cases going forward. And the impact it's having on some businesses is that the cost of dealing with those complaints, even if they're not upheld, is so high that it's causing them big financial issues.
I'm going to go to Mr. John Glenn.
Yeah. Can we focus in on this growth and competitiveness objective? And as I see it, the previous government legislated to institutionalise in our country a secondary growth objective for the regulator. At the same time, there is a call for higher standards of consumer care. And what I always felt when I was the minister in this area, there's a disconnect between what some of your members' organisations would tell me about the regulatory burdens that came from the FCA and the fact that this secondary objective was never properly enabled. And what I'd like to understand is, in the context of the new government's clear statement, which I think the whole economy absolutely needs to operationalise, how do we reconcile this enactment of the secondary objective, which your members really want to happen, with some of the issues that Mr. Dean was talking about around consumer care and so on? Now, Mr. Wright, you've written a report and you've set out a number of objectives on that. But in the end, I can tell you, as a minister in this area, what happens is this consumer scandal overrules the FCA's resolve to assert what those measures should be. Could you tell us what you'd like to see and what your members would like to see, each of you, from the regulator to make this secondary objective real, what that looks like and how we can measure it, please? And I don't mind who starts.
I'll start with Mr. Wright.
Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to be here and give evidence today. I may have a slightly different perspective from my fellow witnesses. I don't represent a trade association. Our focus in this whole debate on the balance between regulation, risk, growth, consumer protection is on better outcomes for the wider UK economy, for companies, and for millions of individuals in every corner of the country. Better outcomes for the industry would be a happy consequence of that. And I think your question really gets absolutely to the heart of the challenge, that the FCA, and to a lesser extent, I think the PRA, have a near impossible job in balancing the three core elements of their statutory objectives between appropriate consumer protection, market integrity and stability and competition. And there can be a tendency in the media and in, dare I say, political scrutiny of the industry and of regulators to almost to default to consumer protection in all of the in much of this debate. And I think on the debate specifically on the secondary competitiveness and growth objective, the argument is that because it's only secondary, it will always be trumped, if you will, by the primary statutory objectives, particularly consumer protection. But that if you were to make it a primary objective, that you could end up in seeking to adjust the balance between risk, growth and stability, you could end up going way too far. And I think when we're thinking about this debate on risk, I think it's really important to remember risk and regulation are not, regulation is not some sort of bogeyman or singular barrier to growth in the UK, and therefore it equally is not a magic wand that you can wave that is suddenly going to catapult UK economic growth back to the top of the G7. But you can identify, and I think the process that the FCA has been going through, the government, the previous government and current government's thinking on this objective, you can identify in the regulatory framework specific examples of where regulation acts as a brake on or impediment to activity which may contribute over time to growth, capital raising, investment, and so on. And we can track that decline in investment in UK companies. We can track the decline in investing in the UK population. I mean, the share of household financial assets, so broadly speaking, people's wealth in this country, the share that sits in bank deposits has gone from a quarter to a third in 10 years. It's gone backwards.
So what do we need to do to stop that? Because your commentary, I don't think, is in dispute, and I'm sure your colleagues this morning would share that. But I understand in your report you put a number of recommendations about 10-year horizons, clarity and all the rest of it. That means actually, doesn't it, resisting some of the calls sometimes to intervene and give compensation in ways that I probably didn't do all the time when I was a minister. What can you say specifically, Mr. Wright, about what you'd like to see?
I think it does involve a degree of, let's call it, courage and certainty and consistency that perhaps has been lacking certainly over the past 10 years that I have been specifically looking at this issue. The constant changes in priorities from government, the constant additional remits. I won't read them out now, we probably haven't got time, but looking at the additional remits that have been layered on top of the regulators over the past decade by previous governments, they're always added, they're never taken away. And we find ourselves in an unusual situation where a government minister might be complaining about a particular focus of the FCA, only to find that 3-5 years earlier it was actually given to the FCA by that government.
Yeah. Sorry.
Rachel Blake MP.
Sorry, I thought John Glenn MP was going to do a follow-up, but is there... Can you suggest any particular remits that you think should be withdrawn? Because I share, and I'm always interested in this critique of government policy, that things are always added and never taken away. But I think the committee's really interested to know if there are specific remits that you would take away.
Go along the panel for quick answers, quick fire round.
I wouldn't want to zoom in on any individual remits. I mean, there is a very long list. I'd be happy to share it. I think a process of rationalisation. I mean, just for example, on sustainable finance, we have got greening the financial system, climate change, transition to net zero, energy security. I think that's the only four on there. It's not to take any of them away. It's just perhaps to adjust, to rationalise, to concentrate into a smaller number of key areas.
Mr. Postings, anything? Yeah, any?
So I don't particularly want to comment on remit rationalisation that respond to John's.
Have you got anything to say about remit rationalisation for your members? No views at all?
Not specifically, no.
Okay. Well,
I think it would be worth going back to the original question,
because
I mean this is the core sort of issue you face as representatives of the industry. Please.
Well, I think if the FCA were to look at each new piece of action they take through the lens of competitiveness and growth, and be willing to be objective about that will help, because it will temper some of the imbalance that we sometimes see. I think an example of where they've done that recently is the listing rule changes. Yeah. And there is pressure there on both sides, but I think they found a way through that allowed for a sort of mature regulation that did try and get that balance between consumer protection, investor protection, and allowing entrepreneurs to want to list here. And I think that should be encouraged. I think the point I would make is that we get the regulation we ask for, because of the pressure that comes from government and from other areas such as the media, so perhaps in response to a crisis or an issue, and when they are put under pressure, there's very little upside in resisting, so that there's lots of downside risk. So they tend to tighten, and then the firms that they regulate also tighten, and within the firms they tighten as well. And I think the thing that we all ought to pause and think about is, we talk about this consumer protection as if it's a sort of singular thing, where actually the more that you see the risk aversion manifesting itself in the regulation, it results in financial exclusion, because products get withdrawn, and people have less access to finance, for example. And so actually, in the end, a different risk crystallises, and consumers are less protected as a result, often, of these changes. So I think if they were able to have an overt, explicable debate that showed that it had been considered in every time they make some regulatory change, whether they're going to look at the overlap between consumer duty and their own existing regulations, I think that would be a really positive way of approaching it. So they can attest that they've thought about it and in a balanced way.
Ms. Gurga, in some of our conversations previously, some of your members were probably most assertive about wanting a primary objective, and in the end, the government at the time settled for a secondary objective. Would you like to sort of describe where your members are now in terms of what they think needs to happen to realise the sort of objectives behind this government and the previous government's sort of secondary competitiveness objective and make it real for you?
You're quite right. We did call for a primary objective, and the focus there for us was actually around growth rather than competitiveness. I think, though, what we have seen since the secondary objective was implemented is positive progress. Both regulators have produced reports. My personal view is I think that the PRAs seem to be a bit more rigorous. They'd had that independent evaluation of how far they'd progressed, and that seemed to be being drilled down throughout the culture of the organisation. But I think what David's saying is correct. There is a need now, and I think even if you look at some of Nikhil Rathi's speeches recently, he's spoken about this. We have to have a mature conversation now around how do we collectively, government, parliament, industry, regulators and consumer groups, strike the appropriate balance between all of these different objectives as articulated in the remit letters. And it's not easy. No. And I think that's why we're not able to give you a single bullet solution, because it does require that collective conversation. What I take as quite positive is the fact that actually all the stakeholders do seem to be coalescing around the fact that actually the balance at the moment doesn't seem to be quite right. I'll go back to this point about the FOS. That relationship between the FCA and the FOS is incredibly important, because what we are seeing is firms becoming cautious because they're anticipating how the FOS might interpret FCA guidance, FCA Dear CEO letters, even FCO speeches, and they're anticipating that might down the line be something that they are assessed against. So I think this is an opportunity for us to collectively reflect what is the appropriate remit for financial services regulators, and what is the right way of creating incentives so that the regulators are not finding themselves in a position whenever there is an issue in the media that they're being called on to react.
Thank you. Mr. Celic, could you tell us what your members are saying? This is a topic, again, that's been discussed for most of the last 5 years. Do you think progress is being made? And is there a risk that we're once again avoiding some difficult challenges? We have one bad conduct thing, and there's always a call for tightening of rules, which has this manifest effect. Is that still what's happening, or is there any sort of positivity on the horizon?
I think, Mr. Glenn, you've hit the nail on the head in the question. I think the problem is that we actually live in a wider regulatory culture. This is wider than just financial services, and this is why I think the Chancellor's comments at the Mansion House are extremely welcome. We are in a country that regulates for risk and not for growth. And I do not see how the government's mission to deliver the fastest growth in the G7 can be achieved under a regulatory culture. The mission, I think. Well, the ambition to be a faster growing economy either way is going to be impossible to deliver without the regulators leaning in behind it. As some of our members have put it to us, for all the consultations that are going on from HMT, DBT and so on and so forth that are going on at the moment, the industrial strategy.
Ms. Gurga talked about ratcheting up. I think Ms. Gurga
if I could, but I think the critical point here is the single most important thing in delivering growth at the moment isn't any of those consultations. It is the 5-year strategic review that the FCA is conducting, because that's where the execution happens.
I think we recognise the tensions, as I think that Mr. Glenn has helped to play out well. But I mean, Ms. Gurga talked about ratcheting up regulation after a consumer crisis. Isn't one of the answers then for the industry to be better prepared to prevent those consumer
Yes,
crises?
I think the industry has done a huge amount on that, and it's worked with the regulators, and the regulators need to be congratulated and credited in what they've done on that. But I think the point here is that every time something goes wrong, the media pressure, the political pressure, the pressure from committees such as this one, is to try and figure out what has gone wrong and to act and to move some kind of legislation or inquiry or whatever it may be. The regulators need to be given the support. If we're telling them, as a society, allow more risk in the system, then back them. And I think that's the critical point here.
Well, there's an interesting question about where that balance of risk comes, given that consumers still have to be protected. I'm going to move on to Dr. Jeevan Sander.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Celic, I want to pick up on something you just said there. I'd agree that we do need to regulate for growth. The Charter set out, I think there's cross-party agreement on that. Look, we've seen the amount that we're now investing in bonds and safe assets as opposed to equity. We're seeing lower rates of return result. You spoke about the FCA's review. What reforms would you like to see the FCA bring forward to ensure that we are investing in high returning assets?
So I think there's a variety of factors here. The pensions review is going to be important and how that plays out. There is a cultural point here. So we can look at structure, we can look at individuals, we can look at strategies. All of these are downstream of culture. And so I think there's a challenge here in making sure that when the FCA looks at encouraging people to save for their retirements, to invest for their retirements and their futures, that you're looking at this from the point of view of where are you going to get your best returns. And there is a reason why Canadian and Australian pensioners tend to get better returns on their savings, and that is because there is less of a detrimental approach and a negative approach taken towards equity investing versus towards, say, bonds or so on. I have had the joy, inverted commas, of spending the last 15 years working on Solvency II or Solvency UK in one form or other. This is another example of a massive ratchet back. At one point we were being told, when Solvency II was being pulled together, that the only safe thing to invest in for people's futures was government debt. That included, at that time, Greek government debt. That was around the 2012 crisis. So there is a sort of unthinking reaction in a lot of this to try and move towards safety, to try and protect customers, but that is, as one of our members put it, a risk of reckless prudence. We are creating too much prudence in the system, and that creates a risk in terms of the sorts of returns that customers and clients will get over the long term.
And then what needs to change then? Is that a change from the FCA side? Is that a change from the pension fund side, or those current future pensioners themselves? Who needs to change and what needs to change? Because surely every pensioner does want a higher return. I know I do, right?
Yeah. And so I think that's partly, and we'll see, as I say, what comes from the pensions review. It's partly the mandate that is set and the direction that is set by government, the expectation that's set by government, and how they want to see the regulators operate and put that in place. This goes back to my point about the 5-year strategic review at the FCA being how a lot of government ambition will be delivered. It's notable when you look at the Financial Services and Markets Act, and Mr. Glenn may have views on this, given that he conducted the 40 consultations or so that led to this. I would argue that has not landed in precisely the way that Treasury expected it to do at that time, because the implementation and the expectation when you get to the supervisory teams, when you get to the regulators, is they add a layer of a risk aversion to it. And then internally, and I've seen this in companies that I've worked at, internally, the internal team, the chief risk officer, the chief regulatory officer, the general counsel, will add a further layer of risk aversion to this. This is the point that Mr. Postings was raising. And so you get this margin that's built in on top, all of which is about avoiding risk, because the system as currently built is about avoiding risk. And the scrutiny that committees such as this one and Parliament and Westminster Hall and the media provide is about avoiding risk.
On competition then, because I would have thought then you would compete along funds as the one that would do well, the one that has the higher returns. So some funds who are saying the FCA is adding in some, the culture's there, and that also impacts internally, and therefore we're adding another premium or a risk kind of inversion, I suppose. Why is the competition not kind of competing this thing away? Why are the firms that are not adding in this extra level of what you think is imprudent kind of saving is not kind of leading to high returns?
Internally, it is all downside risk. You will be penalised if something goes wrong. You are seldom, and this includes the regulators, you are seldom rewarded for something going right. So if you are a regulator at the moment, and I have every sympathy for them on this, if you are a regulator at the moment, you're not recognised or rewarded. You don't get a bonus if something goes right. You don't get a bonus for building innovation. There's a reason the last time the FCA did anything innovative was 10 years ago. It was the sandbox. you are rewarded for things not going wrong.
So the incentive system is wrong both for the FCA and within
Absolutely.
funds. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Celic, you talk about this idea of reckless prudence, and I understand that there's been a concern expressed by many panellists that we've now ratcheted up the amount of regulation. How would you say that the government could avoid kind of business cycle of regulation, where once we start to remove that regulation, more risk is borne by the sector, more consumers bear the harms of lower regulation?
So I'd say consumers are currently bearing the harms of excessively risk-averse regulation because they're not getting the returns. This is really a conversation about where we as a society want to place the dial. I, as a personal anecdote, I despair every time I walk into a bathroom and there's a sign over the hot water tap saying caution may contain hot water. We need to be much more realistic about allowing people to make decisions, equipping them. That requires a full spectrum approach, so we need to equip people in terms of financial literacy, financial capability. There's a huge amount of evidence that suggests that the more capable that people are, the better equipped they are to make decisions. The better equipped they are to make decisions, the less likely they are to be a demand on the taxpayer later on in life because they've made poor decisions. But equally, we need to recognise that people will make poor decisions. That is just the reality. It doesn't mean automatically that somebody needs to be hauled in front of a committee or that compensation needs to be paid. The reality is people in full possession of the facts that they've got available to them will sometimes make bad decisions, and we just have to accept that.
I was going to bring in Chris Coughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Celic. I agree with significant amounts of what you're saying and disclose I spent 5 years working in investment management 10 years ago. There definitely are issues, I guess, around the regulator or the government incentives, but surely, in my experience, there are significant issues around the industry as well. And where I'm going with this is the fee structure and the incentives in the wealth management industry and the active investing industry, given that ETFs, passive investments, have much higher returns, or generally much higher returns over the long run than active fund managers or wealth managers. So the industry has a disincentive to recommend these products to consumers because it results in them being disrupted and loss-making as a result. So I fully agree that equity investing is the way to go over the long run, but isn't there an embedded disincentive in the industry to actually recommend to consumers the best products?
I'm not sure that I recognise that. Certainly from my perspective, if you look at the proportion of, and this is a point that Mr. Wright has already raised, if you look at the proportion of UK household assets that are in equities, for instance, it is not just lower than the United States, it's lower than Germany, it's lower than France, it's heading to unusually low levels. And there's a variety of reasons behind that, and there's a variety of potential solutions around it. I think what is broadly accepted, and you'll know this from your own background, is that over a longer period, the returns from a more equity-based investment portfolio will be better. And my argument would be that what we ought to be doing is equipping people, encouraging them, and not being in a situation where we're somehow seeming to suggest that equity investing is like gambling.
Yeah.
But we're talking about a very long programme here, Mr. Celic. You're talking about an ideal world in your world.
We're
taking school children today.
Yes, but then this is why we need to be looking at longer-term solutions rather than simply short-term solutions. My background is both as a banker and an insurer, and I can tell you, from the point of view of life insurance, you're making a 40-year promise to somebody.
And what others would say, and possibly the FCA themselves, that if you change regulation and you weaken protections for consumers, that maybe 95% of people could get some greater return over a long period of time, but that 5% could be very badly hit. What do you think about that? So
I'm not sure that I would look at this as weakening customer protections. I don't think that the market would benefit. I don't think market participants would benefit. A successful market is based on trust and it's based on confidence in the market, and a critical element of that is consumers being confident in that market. So I don't see it as weakening customer protections. I see it as achieving a better balance between customer outcomes and a wider societal outcome of encouraging growth and investment.
Lola McAvoy MP.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's really interesting listening to you mention about taxpayers footing the bill, because it's something that I think I'm interested in, particularly in my constituency of Darlington. We're talking a lot to people about looking at people's contributions in the round. So instead of looking at people's contributions in isolation of that one paycheck or that one service that they use, it's about their sort of lifetime contribution, how we can make sure that the whole economy benefits from that. You talked about taxpayers footing the bill where people don't invest and make good returns. Obviously, the flip side of that is that taxpayers might have to foot the bill if there was an increase where there was too much risk and people were left sort of in trouble financially. Have you got any examples globally where you think they've got the balance right and we're not seeing huge repercussions of people in very difficult financial straits?
So the ones that would immediately leap to mind again would be Australia and Canada. Now, partly that's because they run slightly different systems. Australia obviously got the super system, so it works in a slightly different way. But you're absolutely right. There are risks on both of these, on both ends of the spectrum on this. But I think the clear thing that is has been established by a lot of the research in this space for a long time, is that ultimately if people don't get better returns than we're managing in the UK at the moment, then the taxpayer will foot the bill because you've impoverished a group of people as they approach later life. And in a time of a demographic challenge for the UK, that becomes enormously problematic. And I think this is something that we need to face up to ourselves as a society. This is a decision that we have made. These are the outcomes of decisions we have made as a society that we've asked the regulators to implement and industry to implement. It strikes me that it's entirely possible that we can take a different decision as a society.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about the later life point, because I see people living longer as progress, as the result of something that we've spent hundreds of millions of taxpayers' money into making people live longer and do well. So we do need to tackle those issues head on. So just to go back to the Australian and Canadian system then, if we were to take some of their best practice, what would you say, like just a bit more detail from the panel, maybe from Mr. Wright? What do you think the best practice, that they're using, how would we adopt that here?
I think the first point to make on looking at comparable systems is that they are all very different. We're very fond of comparing outcomes in other systems, pension systems around the world. We're not so fond of looking at the inputs and the decisions that went into those, often those decisions taken 20, 30, 50 years ago to build the systems that we see today. But, I mean, the primary, the single most important element of the Canadian public sector system, the Australian system, systems closer to home, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, is scale and consolidation. I think that's the driving force behind the government's, or the previous government's push on consolidation and the acceleration of that consolidation under outlined in Mansion House. All of the evidence suggests that bigger funds are able to invest in a wider range of assets at a lower cost overall and in the long term to generate better returns for their members. The other big element that is common to all of the systems that we've mentioned, Australia, Canada, and big European systems, is contributions. And the inconvenient truth, if you will, around UK pensions is that contributions to UK pensions are simply not high enough. At 8%, 3% employer minimum, 5% employee, they're roughly half where most comparable systems sit. In Australia, they are just moving to a minimum 12% of salary contribution by employers alone. In the Netherlands, in Sweden and Denmark, you're talking high teens to low 20s in terms of total contributions. So if we want to really emulate and generate the same sort of outcomes for millions of people in the UK, yes, structural reform, hugely important. We have the most fragmented system of pensions of any system that we've looked at. But we really need to accompany that with some very difficult political decisions. Mr. Celic was talking about long-term decisions. It's very difficult for a government, any government, to take that step on increasing over time contributions, a big decision for which any current government is not going to receive any political reward.
Mr. Glenn.
Yeah, so I was going to ask that question specifically. The Prime Minister is reportedly going to focus on disposable income. If you increase from about 8% to on a ratchet up to 10, 12, 13% where Australia is, that's going to have an impact on disposable income. So is he wrong to do that? Because we've got a direct conflict here between fixing the foundation long-term decision, getting people to save more, and his short-term objective. I mean, this is a hard choice, but arguably previous governments haven't taken it.
We've already seen when we've looked at good gold-plated public sector pensions, some people not paying into those because they've got heavy rents or mortgages to pay, so they're opting out. So I mean, the point is, we'll see a consumer panel afterwards which will tell us about the poorest in society being excluded from many of these things. It's an unrealistic aspiration, yet from a macroeconomic point of view this is desirable. How do we reconcile that?
Right. It's literally the multi-trillion pound question. The first point to make, I think, is that any increases must be made over time. When auto-enrolment was introduced and first outlined nearly 20 years ago, there was a delay to its introduction, and then there was a staggered introduction of contribution rates. Lord Turner's original ambition in the Pensions Commission was that would continue up to about 12 to 15%, but it stopped at its 8%. I do remember the exact year, about 5-6 years ago. So firstly, you would stagger it over probably the next decade. I think the ABI and others have produced sort of roadmaps as to how to do that. Secondly, I think the UK is also an outlier in that the minimum contributions required by employers are significantly lower than those required from employees. When we look at public sector pensions, unfunded public sector pensions, local government pensions, in most UK, in defined benefit pensions in the UK, it's the inverse. It tends to be 2/3 of the contribution.
Sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Wright, in the context of the increase in national insurance contributions, it's unrealistic to expect that to be added to it in the short term. So what you're saying basically is we should have a 10-15 year plan, right, with the changes of pension age, for example, whereas industry is certain of those milestones over the next 15 years or generation on both sides that would give clarity and certainty to markets. Is that basically it?
Yes, it has to be. We cannot magically deliver the outcomes that we see in Australia, Canada, the Netherlands and other markets without going through the long-term thinking and processes that they implemented. So yes, it has to be. This is a 10-20 year...
Which we began to see a little on with auto-enrolment on a small scale.
Ms. Gurga is definitely...
Very briefly, please, because we're
just to build on that, because Mr. Glenn's quite right, the ABI has produced a report which we'd be very happy to share with the committee, setting out what we see is a feasible plan to increase those contributions over time. I think what we would like to see from the government in its phase 2 of the pension review, where it's looking at adequacy, is a focus on implementation of the recommendations back in 2017 around the automatic enrolment review, which were enshrined in legislation through the Pensions Extension of Automatic Enrolment Act 2023, which would effectively mean people can start saving into their pension from the age of 18 from the first pound earned. We all know the earlier you start saving into your pension, the better the returns. I think there are mechanisms that are being considered where you could have flexibility, the so-called sidecar model or the rainy day savings model, where in certain circumstances individuals might be able to draw down a small amount from their pension. But the key focus now, I think, from a consumer point of view, is actually getting people to engage with their pensions. Yes. We know there's £30 billion worth of so-called forgotten pensions. Those are pensions that people have fallen away from as they've changed jobs. And we really need to make sure that people are reconnecting to those, because on average they're worth about £10,000. That's not insignificant to people's financial futures.
Absolutely. We're probably going to be doing further work on pensions, I sense. Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Wright, you spoke previously of this constant change in regulatory priorities over the last decade. So how confident are you, after hearing the Chancellor and other ministers' speeches on this topic, that there will be more stability for the industry over the next 10 years?
It almost sounds like a trick question, but no, thank you. I think I see... I would think about it more as a continuum. This was a process that started 5 years ago in rethinking how far the pendulum, the balance between risk, growth, stability, has swung. The previous government started thinking about this probably around 2017-18, and that there has definitely been progress along the way. I think that the real challenge is just to clarify, and there will be, sorry, let me pause and restart, that there will be tension for the current government between its stated ambition for the industry as an important lever and driver of growth and competitiveness across the UK, and the government's very clear commitment in its financial services strategy and manifesto towards consumer protection. And I think we would be in a better position to answer your question if we fast forward a year or two and look back on the response by government, by this committee and other committees, even when there is some sort of event where people, either directly or indirectly, consumers have been affected by that. So I'm not sure if I fully answered the question, but I don't think it's a moment in time. I think it's much more about looking at it where it sits on the continuum.
If I may just add to that very briefly, I think what will be really important is what comes out of the government's financial services industry strategy. We're delighted that financial services is one of the 8 industries that's been identified for the overall government's industry strategy, and I think that will set the tone, together with the 5-year strategic review from the FCA. But it goes back to the point that Mr. Wright's raised quite rightly, which is in those moments where the ship gets buffeted by tough winds and bad seas, how do we react?
And just to be clear, I mean, to Mr. Wright, in those cases, if they were to happen in the next year or so, is your preference of the committee that there would be an attitude from the government and regulators that those harms should be simply borne by the people that they've fallen victim to those problems?
Not suggesting for a moment that consumer protection should be cast aside in this debate. Quite the opposite. I think we just need to see how we can come to a wider and more nuanced appreciation of how the competing objectives that regulators have. Some recent work has zoomed in very much on consumer protection and apparent failures in consumer protection to paint the FCA as incompetent and having failed, which is not a picture that I recognise at all. I think that there was a very good speech a couple of weeks ago by an SEC commissioner, which I'd be very happy to forward on to the committee, talking about risk. She was presenting at the Ethiopian Capital Markets Authority. That's a market that's just beginning its development as a market. And her point was that we take risk every day in our lives. Choosing a job, choosing a university, buying a house, renting a house, choosing a partner. And yet when it comes to investment and money, we sort of freeze up and we don't think about risk. And regulators are too focused on protecting consumers from normal everyday risk that is an essential part of investment, an essential part of a growing economy, without which companies and economies stagnate. And one can argue, if we look back over the last 10, 20 years, that that's precisely one of the contributing factors to the performance of the UK economy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glenn.
Well, I just want to follow up on this, one of the things you've said about the reforms at the Mansion House, because this whole aspiration of pooling pension funds, we've always said is the right thing to do, starting with local government. But Mr. Celic talked about culture. Is the government being robust enough in putting in hard stops here to actually say, look, if this doesn't happen, we're going to have to do it? Because the picture you paint, and I get the contrast between outcomes and process in Canada and Australia, if we're not, have the government got to the right place in terms of the level of intervention to induce the behavioural change, to create the pooling, to create the macroeconomic advantage? My concern would be that we're not moving quickly enough, and arguably previous government didn't either, I'd just like you to get your assessment in terms of this sort of risk and reward for the economy as a whole. Are we going far enough, or will you say it depends what's in the strategy?
I would say that the mood music so far is very positive. What we've heard from the Prime Minister, what we've heard from the Chancellor, the Business Secretary, I think is very encouraging. But I think you're right to call out that what that now needs to turn into is hard, specific action. And I think it's a little early to get to that. Obviously, I think the initial findings that we're seeing on the pensions review, and obviously there's a second phase coming up, I think are encouraging. I think Mr. Wright has already raised some of the key questions we need to see answered on that. The industrial strategy is out for consultation. As I say, we've also got the FCA strategy. The strategy on trade, I think it's important to look at the trade strategy and the industrial strategy for financial, and indeed the one for professional services together. I'd say the start is encouraging, and as I say, the culture is really important here, and the tone from the top and the mood music that is set. But the concern that I have is that, as I say, the first time the regulators run into difficulty, we all jump up and down on them. And the impression they get given is, again, to the question that was raised earlier by Ms. Yang, is that we're basically saying we're going to push all the risk out of the system. Don't do as we're saying, do as we do, or another interpretation of that. And that what we're all about is some binary choice between economic growth or customer protection, and I don't see it in that way.
One of the things that's been cited in the conversation this morning is around the negative consequences for consumers of being dependent on cash safe savings and low risk products and not defaulting to others. Now, my experience was that the consumer protection narrative is that, and if I think of Mr. Postings and some of his members, there is absolute paranoia around offering, safe pathways to equity-based savings products for fear of 10 years down the line being accused of consumer detriment and being liable for that. Would any of you want to comment on that and how we're sorting that? Yeah, exactly, Mr. Postings.
I think it applies in investment. You're quite right. That's why there's little or no advice given anymore. But it applies in other product areas as well. So the consumer duty, for example, is very well-meaning, but because the life of a product could be 30 years, and people's circumstances can change, their employment can change, economy can change. What looks good today could look less good in 10, 15 years' time. So
your members would be liable for then apparently making bad judgment in year one.
Absolutely. So it drives caution, it drives risk aversion.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I want to sort of move from the philosophical down to some two specific examples. And with the consumer duty, which was just raised, Mr. Postings, the consumer duty, could you describe how your members have used that to implement this issue that the predecessor committee pushed on quite hard when the Bank of England was raising rates, which is how much banks drag their feet in terms of increasing the rates they were paying to savers. Can you describe how your members have changed their behaviour now that we have this principle-based consumer duty with regard to savings rates?
Well, on savings rates, we had the highest pass-through of any country in the EU even before that issue was raised. We then moved, I think, roughly to about 100 basis points above any comparable EU country.
You're comparing apples and oranges there, aren't you? Because that's a different currency and a different interest rate.
I'm trying. No, I think it's comparable. And we're talking about short-term instant access savings because the rates for term savings were already pretty strong, and there was some reflection and pressure from regulators on that point, and so rates did go up. I don't think that's helped The competitive environment particularly, because it makes it much more difficult for some smaller banks, or has made it difficult for smaller banks to raise deposits, because competition has been artificially
Did you just say
impacted.
that it took action from the regulator for you to improve savings rates for consumers?
The regulator did have conversations with some of the banks.
All right. So, and was that aligned with the consumer duty? Would you say that was the consumer duty changing your behaviour, or it was specific action that the regulator took to make sure our constituents got a better rate on their savings when the Bank of England was raising rates?
I have a concern that the regulator it got involved to some degree with pricing, and it impacted the market. I don't think that was necessarily that overt, but there were discussions had. I was at a round table where it was discussed. I think each individual organisation took its own view based on whether it needed to raise funds and its own pricing strategy in the round. So,
have any of your members changed their behaviour as a result of consumer duty specifically?
Generally speaking, yes, absolutely.
With regard to savings rates, we're drilling down into that issue at the moment.
I don't have specific examples where they've told me that that's what they've done, but the consumer duty has had a massive impact on how they view all products. Okay,
and in the interest of time, I'll move quickly on to another issue, which is the consultation that's underway jointly with the Treasury and the FCA on the advice guidance boundary. And one of the things we've raised philosophically is the fact that consumers probably aren't taking enough long-term risk in their long-term savings, and that one of the barriers seems to us, or certainly to me, in terms of consumers, is that very few of them access financial advice, that only 7% of consumers access financial advice. We've made financial advice so expensive and inaccessible that the vast majority of our constituents can't actually get any help with some of these decisions that they're now being asked to take. So do any of you have any strong views on that consultation and any change that should be made?
Yes, we at the ABI and our members are very supportive of the advice guidance boundary review. It's something that we've...
Where do you want it to change to?
We want to be able to address the problem that you rightly call out, which is that fewer than 10% of people are now getting any kind of advice or help as they're taking financial decisions. We have engaged very closely with the FCA on this. We are pleased with the direction of travel that they're taking around so-called targeted support, because we think that is a mechanism through which customers can really be supported in taking decisions that will affect their long-term financial future through retirement potentially or other types of investment. So we are supportive and engaging with that. We think that's a very positive development on the part of the FCA.
You favour it. Does anyone else have a different view?
Simply to add that that's a result, where we are as a result of regulatory overreaction last time. The retail distribution review is a large part of the reason why we are where we are today. It's a decision we have taken as a society to cut the amount of financial advice.
Where do you want it to change to?
I want to see what comes out of the review, but I want to see more people getting financial advice.
Where do your members want it to go to?
Look, to a greater number than 7%, absolutely, and I don't see how we can, if it goes lower than that, I think we are in a pretty bad shape, surely.
Does anyone have a different opinion on this? And I'm not seeing any of you catch my eye on this, but to go to Mr. Wright, you mentioned bad winds earlier. Where are these bad winds coming from?
Are they bad?
The bad winds. You mentioned bad winds. On the
bad winds can create things can happen because of bad winds, I think was your phrase.
Just wondered if you could elaborate on the bad winds that you see out.
What is it? Is that coming from industry or just the world, or
Look, there are. I'm not a geopolitical or macroeconomic strategist, but there are a lot of challenges out there.
They've given me. Sorry, I think it was Mr. Celic who said that talked about the bad winds.
Oh, I think I talked about tough winds.
Tough winds.
Sorry.
Tough winds. What's a tough wind?
Okay.
Forgive me. Sorry, Mr. Wright.
So those could come from, what I was thinking of there was from any direction. This could come from increased regulatory fragmentation globally, increased protectionism, economic slowdowns, so a variety of areas. I mean, basically anything that ultimately impacts on consumers that may result in the FCA having to take an intervention of some form or be criticised for people losing money in some form.
Thank you.
Very quick question. Yep.
previously we moved from a situation where you have commission for advice, so there's more transparency, then the cost of it's too high so people can't afford it, and now nobody does it. Surely, if you want to have more than 7% of people taking advice, how is that paid for? I mean, it seems to me that if you go to the money and advice service or the online thing, you get quite generic advice. That then is not deemed to be rich enough to make an investment decision. But if you've got a level of understanding of financial services and products, you've got a level of embedded risk aversion. How do you avoid that for the average consumer or the average household who's got no financial education? Even if we might aspire to change it, haven't you got a sort of really difficult problem here? How to solve this for the mass market, not well-educated middle-class MPs.
So that's absolutely right, and one of the challenges here is the pressure on costs. So we get a lot of pressure on costs from regulators and so on, so how we address this is absolutely right. I would look both to the past and the future. I mean, the reality is millions of people used to get their advice every week, financial advice every week, from the man from the Pru. So that person, I should declare an interest. I used to work at the Prudential. I was the man from the Pru for a while. But literally, every week, people would turn up, they'd take their premiums, they would talk to people about what their incomings were and their income wells, what their outgoings were, and so on. Obviously, we can't go back to those days. That world has passed. But what is interesting, and there's some really interesting work that's happening in the United States on this, is the extent to which a pot becomes economically viable for financial advice by utilising AI. So I'm not saying that AI is a magic bullet here, but it could be part of the solution. But again, we need to make sure that the regulatory structure around that is in a better place than it is at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Rachel Blake MP.
Thank you. We've spent much of this session talking about the balance between risk and the impact on consumers. And just earlier this year, we saw the decrease around repayments from the maximum liability from 415,000 to 85,000. And there was some discussion about where what was driving this decision. Can you elaborate more on the trade-off between innovation here and, again, the risk to consumers?
Are you talking about authorised push payment fraud reimbursement limits? Is that what you mean? Yeah. The 85,000 limit covers about 99% of all claims anyway, and it's in line with the FSCS limit. Mm-hmm. But I think your question was about innovation, was that?
Well, this has been driven by a sense that fintech companies would be disadvantaged by the 415,000, but the scale of the number of claims against it, you've alluded to 99% being covered by being the 85,000. So how do you think this change will balance innovation and risk-taking?
I think it's a sensible change. It brings it in line with the FSCS limit for deposits, which means you don't get more protection on payments than you do on your actual bank account. The 50-50 reimbursement that was brought in under the PSR's changes, I think will help significantly as well, because it means that all participants are now subject to this rather than just those who volunteered. And it means that the receiving bank has more skin in the game, significantly more skin in the game, and therefore that should help innovation when it comes to fighting economic crime. The burden was falling purely on the sending bank and a small subset of those in the past.
Can you just elaborate on your final points in terms of deterring financial crime and protecting against it? What might this do to those people trying to...
Reimbursement in and of itself doesn't really impact that, except to the point I made about receiving banks now having to be quite thoughtful about the sort of accounts they open and maintain, because they're now liable for 50% of the reimbursement. Or not just banks, but payment institutions. The fight against authorised push payment fraud and economic crime in general is much broader than that, and should involve the tech companies and the telcos. And I was delighted that the Chancellor and the Home Secretary wrote to them recently, starting the process of bringing them into the fold. And I think that bringing crypto exchanges into regulation, which is what the FCA are proposing, will help, because that's where they often cash out. So having a whole ecosystem approach to push payment fraud in particular would be really helpful. It could go further. The tech companies and I wouldn't want to tar them all with the same brush, because some are working very hard, some could do more. Have a big part to play in trying to stop this crime at source before we get to reimbursement. And I think there's that's where the focus should be, and that's where the innovation really needs to be.
And what would that look like?
Using their data to close down sites more quickly, or to actually go through some sort of KYC AML process for opening accounts. So, for example, eBay worked pretty hard on that, others less so. And if they adopted similar processes to eBay, we'd probably have less crime.
Thank you very much, Ms. Blake.
Thank you. We've spoken quite a lot today about the competitiveness of the UK regulatory market. So just interested in, how do you think the second Trump presidency could play into that if the US starts to swiftly deregulate and we have a race to the bottom, and how should the UK respond?
Mr. Postings.
We're not advocating deregulation. What we're advocating for is a shift in the pendulum, a small shift in the pendulum, to get more balance between risk and protection. And I think we should stick to that and not fight some deregulatory downward spiral. I think that in itself will be competitiveness, if you like. I think having high standards of regulation is a good thing, but in attempting to protect consumers at all costs, we end up with different risks materialising, which cause them problems in all other parts of their lives, such as access to credit, for example. And we can see the same with SMEs. And so getting that balance right here is what we need to do. I don't think we should fight some sort of deregulatory battle with anybody else.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I thank our witnesses very much? We've had an interesting discussion teasing out the difficulty in balancing the different objectives of the regulator, which I think we thought we might do. It's been certainly a punchy conversation at times. And the panel's also raised the question of the balance of risk and the growth that may come from it. I'm sure we may get a slightly different perspective from our second panel. And the industry is claiming that risk aversion is being added at each layer of regulations, and additionally on the firm side from compliance, and that serious questions also exist about how prepared consumers are prepared to take on that risk. And obviously we also strayed into the areas of pension and pension investment, which is a little bit beyond this session, but we'll be looking at in future. Can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time. We're going to just break before the next session. Order. Order. Welcome back to the Treasury Select Committee on Tuesday the 3rd of December 2024. And now we've got in front of us consumer representatives to discuss the work of the Financial Conduct Authority, following on from our session with industry representatives. So I'm delighted to welcome Helen Charlton, who's the chair of the Financial Services Consumer Panel, Mick McAteer, who's the co-director for the Financial Inclusion Centre, a very important organisation. Rocio Concha, who's the Director of Policy and Advocacy and the Chief Economist at Which. I have to say my children will be pleased that you're in front of me. They're big fans of Which. Might have to get my little moment in that makes them think this job is worthwhile. And Julie Hunter, who's a member of the Financial Services Consumer Panel. So array of great expertise in front of us. And so we're going to kick off, first of all, with Mr. Bobby Dean.
Thank you, Chair. I think many of you are listening just now, and industry did put it a little bit more delicately than I'm about to. But I think I heard that politicians, media, and by extension, consumers overreact to moments of consumer harm, and we need to accept that as a consequence of risk. Who has a view on that?
I'm happy to start.
Yes.
I will say I disagree. and also, can I clarify something? Something in the panel was said before about that there is agreement that the balance of the FCA have gone too far on consumer protection, and it actually mentioned consumer groups. That is not true. We don't agree with that. What I also don't agree that is a trade-off between growth and consumer protection, and can I explain why? And that is why we were not fans of putting a secondary objective here. I will tell you why. For growth, you need competition. That is in the primary objective of the FCA. For competition, you need not only the supply side, that is super important, and you have the supply side here in the panel before. You also need the demand side. You need the consumers to prove, to go for new innovations, and that will require some risk to try, move from the incumbent. And for that, you need consumer policy, you need consumer protection. Because let's be clear, we talk about consumer protection in general terms, but what is consumer protection? Consumer protection is making sure that you have access to the right information, and it's honest information that is accessible to you. Consumer protection is about making sure that if something goes wrong on the basis of the information that has been provided to you, because that information maybe was wrong, you also have protection, and that gives you confidence. And you need to make you need to make sure that when you decide you have the information and you decide to move your providers, you are able to move without unnecessary costs to be able to react to this. So I personally, if we are talking about sustainable growth, I don't see that there is a trade-off. And can I say something that the government actually said? Because the government, in their mission, which, by the way, as a consumer organization, super supporters of the growth mission, that we need to focus on that because that will benefit consumers. But they also said growth has to be felt in every part of the country and makes everyone, not just a few, better off. We cannot achieve that without well-designed consumer policy. You can have short-term growth. I mean, an example would be the payday lending, and we know how it ended. So if you want trust, if you want consumers to engage, if you want an industry to thrive, you need to make sure that you have the right consumer policy in place. That is what will be my view.
Thank you. And others to come up.
If you don't mind me adding, I must say I didn't recognise the sort of the trade-off that the industry trade bodies were advocating previously. There, every single episode of mis-selling has been tried to be addressed by the FCA and regulators previously, and on no single occasion was every single consumer given redress. There was an acceptance in every single episode of mis-selling that we couldn't have perfect redress. And all the regulators in the past, and I speak as an ex-FCA board member and FSA board member, the regulators have never ever claimed, and never have consumer groups ever claimed, that there has to be 100% success. We've never asked or never expected a zero failure regulatory regime. So I'm afraid I just don't really recognise the characterisation of the trade bodies' arguments, and this idea that we live in a risk-free society. We've just seen one of the biggest transfers of risk in the pensions market from defined benefit final salary pension schemes to defined contribution pension schemes, where individuals are now expected to take on more personal risk to meet their retirement expectations. We've seen a real individualisation of risk in the pension market, Not only that, we have one of the weakest social security systems in the Western world. Individuals are actually exposed to more risk in this country than their counterparts in most of northern Europe. There was a lot of talk about let's encourage a risk-taking society, and they used other examples in other countries. But of course, those countries have got really strong foundations of a decent state pension system, a decent social security system, which actually encourages individuals and indeed companies to take risks, because people know if there's a good safety net there, a protection there, they're more willing to take risk. So I'm afraid I just don't accept the characterisation of the industry on this one.
If I could just pick up on something that both of you have touched upon. So Ms. Concha, you spoke about how we need to give confidence to the demand side for growth, and then you mentioned some of these sort of mass redress events as well. What impact has things like PPI and the potential ruling on motor finance had on the consumer demand?
Well, the first thing that I will say is that that demonstrate that there was harm for those consumers. And when you have an event like this, as a consumer, you lose trust in the financial service. So that is the impact that I have. So I think that the focus should be in making sure that we are not ripping off consumers, because then when that big harms materialize, consumers lose confidence.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come today. I think trust and confidence was mentioned briefly this morning, and to reinforce the point that's just made, we must remember that the trust in the financial services sector is low. Yeah. I mean, the FCA's own Financial Lives survey says that only 41% of UK adults have confidence in the UK financial services sector, and 36% agreed disagreed that financial firms are honest and transparent. Those are very low trust levels, which are inevitably going to be worsened by scandals and mis-selling that is publicised. So we have to bear that in mind, and I don't think consumers are going to take risk if they don't have confidence in the sector. And I think it's also important to point out that the Consumer Duty deals with foreseeable harm. The Act actually requires consumers to take responsibility for their own decisions. So the portrayal that there is too much protection, there is too much risk protection, I think does need a bit of a balance.
So if trust is so low, what do you think we need to see come out of the potential reforms to the financial ombudsman services? We've seen these reforms spoken about in the context of.
I think on the redress side, there needs to be a fair, impartial, consistent outcome for consumers when they go to redress. The sort of characterisation of this sort of risk for firms around the Financial Ombudsman Service. I mean, the Financial Ombudsman Service is impartial. It's a fair and reasonable decision in all the circumstances, and arguably, that is needed for consumers to feel that they have got, firstly and importantly, an impartial result from a third party, rather than the FCA applying its own its own approach. And we do feel, in terms of sort of mass redress versus the cases going through the FOS, there is a question around how long a redress scheme might take, because arguably consumers they just want things sorted out quickly. They want that redress quickly, even if it's not 100%. Maybe they would actually prefer just to get the main bulk of it sorted quickly so they can get on with their lives. So I think there are questions to be considered around how redress and a mass redress works in that way. We're still thinking through, by the way, our response to the consultation. It's not due till January, so we're still reflecting on that.
Can I add something on that? I think that definitely there is an opportunity for the FCA and the folks looking more at the data that they're getting. There is a wealth amount of information on the decisions that the folks have taken. And we recently did a piece of research on that uses LLMs, AI, to read a lot of information of that decision and uncover a lot of harm in particular sector in the insurance market. And I think, and that actually we have shared this with the FCA, we have shared this with the Fox. There is a lot of information there that is not being used to anticipate issues in a particular market, for example. That is a conversation that the Fox and the FCA have to see. We are seeing a particular company or a particular industry where we are seeing a lot of decisions that upheld, and there is an issue there. There is an opportunity to intervene early before it's a mass address issue, for example.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Mr. Todd, just on the time point as well, you said it's in consumers' interest for the process to be sped up, even if that means they don't necessarily get the full redress they could have done otherwise. So do you have any comment on the FCA's pushing back of the time for complaints to be submitted and read and heard in relation to motor finance?
At the moment, it's so uncertain.
Yeah.
And I think we have to be very careful that we just don't know what the outcome is going to be from these court cases. So I think it's very difficult for the FCA to come to a firm decision on what it does when. I think we are quite concerned it should not be too long. I can't remember what the submission date is that we put in. Our submission's just gone in on the date that we want, and I can certainly give you the response that we've put in. We recognise that on the motor finance cases, it is very uncertain.
Thank you very much. Lola McAvoy, briefly.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come in because I actually ran out of time on the last panel. I wanted to ask them this. So I thought you would be very well placed to answer about the trust point, because nobody mentioned trust, or I missed it if they did, in the last panel, and you've all mentioned it individually. I think one of the big problems that we've got in our growth forecasting is around people having trust to spend their money and invest it with a more risky mandate, which is fine. What do you think industry can do if they want less regulation, which they've made quite clear? What do you think industry can do to build up trust in their sector and in their products?
Happy to go first. I think that I found this a really interesting debate about this boundary of responsibilities between consumers and the industry. I think the perception left by the trade bodies was that regulation prevents the industry from giving consumers advice on risky financial products, but it doesn't. It really doesn't. I think the way they've characterised this again, they made it sound as if they're unable to target people with targeted support and whatever. The rules actually say there's nothing wrong with firms actually identifying a narrow target market and actually communicating with them to inform them about different types of choices. Indeed, the FCA and the Pensions Regulator and the Information Commissioner's Office recently put out a letter clarifying, explaining to firms yet again there is nothing wrong with targeting consumers and saying, look, you do realise that you might not get enough income in retirement unless you take action. So they're not actually prevented from doing that. Now, I mean, the trade bodies are very smooth. They're very well resourced. They present a great case about regulation as stifling innovation, causing financial exclusion, and so on. I mean, really what they're after here, and as part of the FCA's call for input on streamlining its rules and so on, the amount of rules in the rule book doesn't actually create the majority of the regulatory costs for firms. What creates the cost for firms is having to employ risk specialists, compliance officers, lawyers, because they can't trust themselves to interpret high-level principles. And the reason why we have such a thick rule book, in my experience anyway, as a campaigner for 30 years, is that the industry itself couldn't trust itself to interpret high-level principles. They're the ones who have driven the demand for greater clarification, more guidance and so on, because they couldn't really interpret what the legislation, what Parliament intended and what the regulators intended. So that's where the big drive for the size of the rule book has come from. There is actually nothing stopping firms developing clever AI-driven models tech-driven models, data-driven models, to more sophisticated target consumers to make recommendations. What they want is a clarification. They want to redraw the boundary of responsibility. So if something does go wrong, then the liability for redress is no longer with them. It is transferred to the consumer. This is an attempt to reduce the likelihood that they will pay redress for giving poor advice. I think that's what really it's all about. Yeah.
Thank you, that's very interesting. John
if can I just follow up? If the chair of the FCA says that there are 13 million consumers who have basically got 430 billion left in cash, right? Mm-hmm. But you've said there's nothing preventing the market from giving tailored advice. Presumably, given the economic advantage to those companies of giving that advice, why is that not happening then? Because they wouldn't be not doing it if they thought they could make a profit out of it, would they?
Because they don't trust themselves. So that when it comes
when
it comes to trust and confidence, I really believe that the issue here is the industry trusting itself to make the right decisions when engaging with low to medium income households. So I mean, maybe I'm cynical after 30 years of campaigning, but I suspect that the advice guidance boundary review, certainly from the banking sector's point of view, is intended to allow banks to more easily target people with sizable deposits to then upsell them to investment products that generate higher fees. That's my cynical interpretation. But they can use AI technology, targeted interventions to go after and actually deal and communicate.
So, Mr. McAteer, you say cynically, but just to put the points from the previous panel, they would say, and there's a lot of talk about lazy capital, that actually you could get better returns.
You could do, yeah.
So what's when you're cynical? Yeah. What drives your cynicism? Because if it works as some of the industry might want it to, then people get better returns and everyone's happy.
Absolutely.
So where's your cynicism coming?
Well, my cynicism is that the golden prize for the sector this time is to try and the boundary of regulation. It's a very hard boundary to draw because it doesn't actually exist. It moves over time and whatever. But the essence of their lobbying efforts at the moment is to shift the boundary towards consumers. So if there is mis-selling, then they will have less redress liability because the rules change. And I would say, I'd like to see more consumers investing for the long term. I really would actually.
Because that's a massive consumer detriment.
It is a huge detriment, massive detriment.
That's my point. Exactly
I would love to see that. Absolutely right. But there's nothing preventing the industry using technology to encourage those choices. What they want to do is actually be able to do that at a mass market level by reducing the liability for redress. That's really the game plan for the industry. Yeah.
And I don't know if you want to bring in.
I just want. Sorry, yes, I don't want to.
Swiss contract.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, we have not done proper research. The system have not done proper research to know what are the barriers, why people are keeping so much on cash. We just know that there are a lot of people are keeping on cash, a lot of cash, and they are not investing. But actually, the statistic, the analysis, didn't go into explaining why is that? What are the barriers that consumers are facing? Is the lack of advice? Is just the particular circumstance? Is distrust in the system? What is it? And can I say that actually there are products out there that are very cheap? I think that NatWest have a product that is £10 to get advice. Still, they are not getting enough takeoff of this. Why is that?
But isn't the reality at the moment? We're in a situation where the poorest consumers, because of the lack of pathways. Mr. McAteer suggests that it's because the banks and the financial institutions are not using the opportunities of AI to create products and pathways. But we're in a situation where consumers are losing, growth in their cash if they put it in equities. And more than that, what they're actually doing is going on TikTok and buying Bitcoin and other products where the risk levels are completely different. So what I'm trying to get at is surely there needs to be a meeting of minds here.
It does.
Because if we don't have some compromises, as a minister for 4.5 years in this area, I felt when I speak broadly to your sector, it was you need to go further, and to the industry sector, you're going too far, and we'd end up in a situation where nobody seems to be satisfied. But we've got to find some pragmatic solutions. I just want to say two other things, if I may. Clearly, things evolve over time. there was a market failure with funeral plans. So we asked the regulator to put them in, right? And then we were exposed because some firms went bust because they would have been operating under a false prospectus. London Capital and Finance, we got Dame Elizabeth Gloucester to do a review. We ended up, within a year, paying out 100 million. Within that, there were quite wealthy people who were getting paid 80p in the pound for investing in Dominican property products. Surely you're in a situation there where, to the point of the previous panel, those risks were reasonable risks that well-informed people were taking, but there were also people who were caught up in that, poorer consumers who needed redress. Have we got the right... I mean, back to this issue of risk, we have got to surely be much more willing to segment consumers, because I'm most concerned about the vulnerable ones missing out on their growth in their cash. Whilst I think people have... It's not just self-certified high net worth people who can go into that. Have we got in the right place?
Ms. Hunter. On that risk, on the issue of that discussion on risk, absolutely we need to segment more people. We need to ask ourselves, what is the risk that we are talking about? What is that risk? What is that we want individuals to take? Who is going to take this additional risk? What are the type of individuals? Segment that individuals. Who are the people that we are going to put? Are they have the capacity to bear that risk? So we need to... I mean, when we go into this discussion, it's very difficult to discuss in abstract. Mm-hmm. We need to have a very specific discussion and say, what are the risks? Where we want individuals to take more risks, and then which individuals we want them to take that risk, and then say, is that those individuals understand the risk that they are taking, and they have the capability to actually to bear that risk. And unless we go in specific, we will always be in these hypothetical discussions.
Hunter. Thank you. So just the conversation about responsibility and risk, I mean, obviously it's all tied together, but I agree with the right balance must be found, but it's really important, although consumers need, supposed to act responsibly, make decisions, there's a really important prerequisite here, which is that firms must be giving consumers the right information at the right time so they can understand, the terms, the risks, the protections, those kinds of things, and that helps them weigh up the facts and then take a calculated risk or make an informed decision. So I think when we were having the risk discussion, it's not that, we're anti taking all risk. Yes, consumers can choose to take a risk, but they must be well informed first, and that's what the consumer duty pillar of understanding is there for, is to make sure that firms have a responsibility to provide consumers with the right information. And in fact, in past consultations, we've advocated the consumer responsibility principle in the Financial Services Market Act to be amended to take into account that consumers should only be deemed responsible for decisions where firms have met their obligations under the consumer duty. So I just want to make that point about it's about informed decisions, and also just to build on Rossio's point, it should be evidence-based. So firms should be, coming back to the trust issue, firms need to be learning about what foreseeable risks of harm are so they can mitigate those foreseeable risks of harm. They should be learning from them so they can prevent future harm to consumers, and that's evidence-based complaints data, talking to customers, talking to consumer stakeholders as well to understand what those real risks are.
Thank you. Mr.
So on the subject of risk, so I fully think there is an issue with the fee structure in the industry, and to disclose I used to work in investment management. But is there an issue around the realities of equity investing? If you invest in equities, there's a very good chance you're going to lose 30% of your money in the next year. If you hold it for 10 years, you'll probably make a pretty good return, but there's a chance you'll make zero. But if you hold it for 15 years, you'll almost certainly make a fantastic return. And it is an issue that your average consumer will find it very difficult to hold their nerve. Exactly, after year one, if they lose 30% of their money, and firms maybe are scared of recommending that to your point, Ms. Hunter, around consumer education or understanding because of the psychological impact of that loss. And I'm thinking specifically about the collapse of Neil Woodford's fund recently, which, to be clear, I do not know the specifics of the case, but I do know that Neil Woodford was a highly reputable fund manager prior to this incident, and that 5,000 retail investors are now suing Hargreaves Lansdown off the back of it, and clearly I have no comment over it, but one might think that this, how does this play into overall trust? And you could construct an argument that, here's a highly reputable fund manager and things do sometimes go wrong, yet this is obviously clearly massively damaged trust in the industry.
We can't talk about individuals, just to be very careful.
So it's a general example.
But I think we're not saying, obviously things will happen, but it's about taking the steps. It's due diligence, really. If there was a car on the market, if you're looking at product safety as an example, and you knew there was a brand of car where the brakes were failing all the time, you'd take steps, wouldn't you, to make sure that was addressed. So things can happen, but it's about learning from those mistakes and being agile and responsive to address the consumer harm.
I think it's also important to say, if I may, that for consumer inertia, may not be a risk reason. Consumers, there may be an issue around sort of understanding. There may be an issue around just the sheer amount, going back to the duty, the amount of information that's there. And I do think firms need to do more to understand that consumer inertia. It's not just an aversion to risk. And I think that when we put in our response to the FCA on the advice guidance boundary review, we said they'd started from completely the wrong end. They'd started with the solution rather than going to what does the regulatory system do now for consumers? What support do they need? What are the barriers to them getting help and support? And how, therefore, should we as a regulator and the industry overcome those? And that is part of the problem, going back to Mick's point about going to a straight solution. We were really concerned about that.
Thank you very much indeed. Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's fair to say that this panel has some differences in view from the previous panel of industry representatives. How well matched do you feel in terms of lobbying power and getting the ear of the regulator compared to those the industry lobbyists? And I'll start with Mr. McAteer.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that. I was looking at some before I came here, evidence from an organisation called Positive Money, which a few years ago looked at the size of the finance lobby, and there are 18 financial trade associations with turnover of more than £1 million. Their total they have a combined turnover of £145 million. When compared to the combined resources we have here and all the consumer groups put together, we come nowhere near that. The Positive Money research also found that, I think it was 2 years ago, that 1/3 of meetings with Treasury ministers were with representatives from the financial sector as well. More than any other industry. Given its size and importance, of course. And from memory, whenever I used to have time to analyse consultation responses to the FCA, something like 90% of the responses would come from industry groups or individual firms or trade bodies. So we are massively outgunned when it comes to representation at every single level of the decision-making process.
Ms. Contra, Ms. Charlton.
And I would like to say that for the last the 2.5 years since I've been in my post as chair of the panel, this is something where the panel has consistently made the point to the FCA around the imbalance between the industry voice and consumer stakeholders. It is the reference to the number of consultation responses that the FCA has from the industry versus consumer stakeholders, and that is because consumer stakeholders are so under-resourced. For example, there was a recent consultation which had 83 responses and only one from the consumer organisation, and that was ourselves, the panel. There is a real problem here, and we have made suggestions to the FCA as to how they could be more proactive, be more strategic, and facilitate engagement more. I think and we've also insisted that the FCA must be much more transparent in its decision-making as to how much input it's had from consumer organisations, how it takes that into account, and how that influences its final decision. And it really needs to make that very clear in its feedback statements on its policy proposals. I'm hoping that in its next strategy it will take that into account and it will be promised more transparency. and there will be progress on engaging with consumer organisations and how it goes about getting that consumer voice into its thinking.
Thank you, Ms. Charlton. I wanted to get into this particular example of the lowering of the limit for authorised push payment refunds. So for those who have transferred money to fraudsters, essentially, that has now been taken to, I think, about a fifth of what it was, and the limit is now 85,000. I was wondering if anyone wanted to comment on the process.
Ms. Concha.
So, thank you. And by the way, I endorse what has been said about resources and access. Also, it's not only about through consultation process, it's also outside consultation, and this is a perfect example. So the APP case at the level of reimbursement was properly consulted with the evidence put there by all the parties, and a decision was taken. The next few months forward, a decision has been changed on the basis of no additional information, just because pressure from some parts of the industry that have not provided, at least to the rest of to consumers, what additional evidence is there to reduce the level of reimbursement. So this is a proper case where actually we're thinking that the regulator is listening more to the industry and politicians, by the way. There was quite a lot of political pressure as well here. So definitely an imbalance. And we, to this day, we have asked for the additional evidence and we have not seen it.
Yeah. Thank you. And a broader point about the way that the industry affects lobbying. Do you see any difference between the way that the government and politicians, as you mentioned, Ms. Concha, and the regulators, on the other hand, listen to consumer concerns?
In what sense? Difference in?
So for politicians and the government, the way that they are responding to, for example, constituents or consumer concerns from groups like yours versus the way that the FCA and other regulators deal with those concerns. Do you see much of a difference in those two areas?
What I see at the moment,
Mr. McAtee.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting speaking as someone who's been on the inside and the outside, of the regulators. I don't recall a time in the past where, as a board member of the FCA, I ever felt overly influenced by government ministers. There was a very, very clear, division really of, a real understanding of the respective responsibilities of Parliament and regulators. I've always understood that it was Parliament's job to determine what society expected of regulated firms, and it was the job of the regulators then to implement those expectations through rules and guidance and what have you. So I never ever felt in the past that the government was overly influencing the direction of regulators. However, I do think at the moment this secondary growth and competitiveness objective is in danger of becoming almost like a de facto primary objective. And I think it was a point Helen made before, because just thinking about it, it isn't just the FCA that's under pressure here. We've had the deregulation of Solvency UK. A lot of our big insurance companies are much stronger than they really look due to the way Solvency UK is structured. We've had the advice guidance boundary review we've talked about. We've had the weakening of the workplace pension charge cap recently. We've got the value for money framework, which is trying to drive more money into UK industry, which may or may not be a good thing depending on the cost of the capital and the nature of the capital. We've had, the things like the push for, as I say, the authorised push payment fraud thing. All these things are building up, and really, really feels now that every sector, every subsector, every regulatory initiative, this secondary growth objective is really starting to impinge on the freedom of the supposedly independent financial regulator. And I recognise that's
just get a quick other points of view from the panel, and it's quite different to what we had.
I really would like to speak to this. Thank you very much, Chair. We, as a panel, we do not have a scrutiny role with the FCA, and we don't hold the FCA to account. But our role is to keep the FCA to its consumer protection objective. And the secondary objective is what we see as a panel as the top risk for consumers. And we are constantly saying, mainly to the FCA, but we would urge the government to do the same, and anybody, for that matter, speaking on this topic, to remember that the consumer protection is a primary objective, and for the reasons that were given at the outset, this is not. This should help growth. It's not an anti-growth point. So that consumer protection objective sits with the others as a primary. And loose language around balancing and trade-offs between the secondary objective and the primary objective are really very damaging. So we have urged the FCA that it must keep to its primary and secondary objectives and be very, very careful to do so. So I think I really wanted to make that point.
We can hear very briefly from
Well,
Rich.
I think that you have the industry here, and I think some of you asked the industry, give us examples where there is a trade-off. I didn't hear any examples. So I think that if we are going to look at this seriously, we need to look at the evidence. Ask the industry, what are the areas of consumer protection that are preventing you to innovate? What innovations you are unable to do?
To be fair to Mr. Wright, he did say it's just that we've got lots of regulations that are very similar. Perhaps they could be amalgamated and made simpler.
How you approach that? And then what does that mean? That let's remove a lot of stuff to make it simple. I think that what we need is to have a proper conversation. Like, what are the things that actually in that group of regulations are preventing? What are these group of things that are stopping you? And what this group of things is stopping you to do? And then if we remove it, if we consider removing it, what does that mean for consumers?
Well, on the subject of consumer risk, I'm going to bring in Dr. Jeevan Sander.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to pick up on some of the stuff around risk. I thought it was very interesting that actually I think there is maybe a happy agreement or some sort of agreement itself in industry, which is that there's not enough risk being taken. So £430 billion in cash savings. Would the panel agree that is too much money in cash that we should be, or rather consumers should be investing elsewhere? And the question is why they're not.
I think it goes back to the point I was making earlier. You have to ask consumers. You have to, and that evidence base around it isn't there, and the inertia and the barriers to wanting to take those risks. Are huge, and I just don't think that sort of evidence base, is going back to the points made earlier, has really been amalgamated.
We need to look at this.
And I also just wanted to say that your clerk's reference before today, a speech that was given by the Chief Operations Officer at the FCA around resilience. And consumer resilience, and I think, again, the terminology needs to be really careful here. Because financial resilience, I'm sure Mick would say, is the ability of a consumer to withstand shocks, and we're talking about death, bereavement, losing your job, critical illness, and I'm worried that the narrative around consumer resilience, especially in the industry, could be sort of skewed a bit towards resilience to risks in the system, as we hear. Again, so it's a question of language, and I really want, I think we need to be really careful about what we're talking about when we're talking about consumer empowerment to take decisions, to take risks, and financial resilience, which is the ability to withstand a shock to your finances.
Thank you. Ms. Hunter wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, so on those cash savings in particular, I'm considering the comparisons both internationally over time. So are we holding more cash than usual, and are we holding more cash than other countries?
I don't know this. I don't know the answer to that statistically.
I suppose because there's a question then, because what's interesting to me at the very least is we're all kind of agreed that should be more cash being invested, but it's not being invested at the moment. And actually it could be a default option that no one's quite getting there. And actually this isn't about regulation, but around default options. I'm not sure, Mr. McAteer, you might want to...
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It depends how you define holding too much cash. Sorry for being a policy nerd here, but I mean, we did some analysis in this. I must say it's quite a while ago actually, and the UK had quite a low savings ratio compared to other countries. But once you add back in the imputed benefits of defined benefit pension schemes, then our savings ratio was actually quite high. But a lot of that was down to how you calculated the benefits of defined benefit final salary pension schemes. So look, I I represent the Financial Inclusion Centre. We're particularly concerned about people who are excluded as well as the underserved. And a lot of this conversation is how do you get people to invest their savings in higher return products. But, 48% of households have less than £1,500 worth of savings. For them, the idea of investing in high risk products for long-term growth, it's a bit of a pipe dream at the moment. In places like Northern Ireland, 43% of Northern Irish households pensioners rely on the state pension for their primary source of income, compared to 33% in Great Britain. So I think for a lot of population, we're a long way off from this kind of conversation. So, but above that group, above that excluded group, there is the underserved group, which I think is really what the conversation around risk taking is about. This supposedly underserved market. Now, the Retail Distribution Review simply exposed the fact that the financial services industry couldn't provide regulated financial advice on terms that made sense for the industry and for large parts of the mass market. It didn't cause an advice gap. It just exposed the fact that actually they couldn't really serve it on economically viable terms. But look, if we can get more people investing more for the long term, I think that's got to be a good thing. This £430 billion figure should be converted, at least some of it should be converted into more productive savings. Absolutely agree with that. But I think the question is, what does it take to actually do that?
Ms Hunter, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, just wanted to respond on your point about cash savings, but it's also relevant to the fraud app scam thing as well, because I think it brings us back to the consumer stakeholder voice and gathering the evidence needed before making decisions, because we talked about how the consumer stakeholders really underrepresented, really under-resourced, and the FCA of course has the panel, has the consumer network, has Financial Lives survey. That takes 2 years turnaround pretty much. But we've been advocating for, ad hoc surveys, speaking to consumers on specific topics, so that they can be agile and responsive to emerging harms, because we know that things are moving very, very quickly. So I think in terms of cash savings, this is an example of where more targeted research is needed to bulk up the consumer stakeholder voice. If you don't understand what the impacts are, then go out and ask people who are being affected by those impacts or by those harms, rather than just saying, well, we don't have the evidence there, so therefore we'll make a decision based on what other stakeholders are telling us.
Well, as a former academic, I'm very much in favour of more research. Chair, I'm happy to
Thank you very much, Dr. Sander. Dame Harriet Baldwin MP.
Thank you very much. Well, Parliament obviously set out the consumer duty, and that was the request from Parliament in terms of legislation. And I just wondered if you as consumer experts can point to some specific examples of where the implementation of consumer duty has made a difference and improvement for consumers. Has anyone got any?
Well, I can start. I won't start with any specific examples, but I'd like to just give a bit of background as to where we think it's working and where more work needs to be done, really. Obviously, it's a pioneering initiative. It's got very clear objectives, sets high, clear expectations for firms, and I think demonstrates FCA commitment to consumer protection. But I think we need to understand it's really early days, and setting out your aims and your principles is all really good. But there's two more really important steps, which is implementation and impact. And at the moment, it's really difficult for us to assess how it's being implemented by firms. We can only, hear little case study stories, really, of what's going on, sort of behind the scenes. And we really need, for successful implementation, for the consumer duty to be really embedded into firms' mindset, policies, practices.
Don't you think you should have been able to spot a difference by now?
6 months.
Ms. Charlton.
Sorry, it's a year.
Anyone?
Yes, yeah. I think there was a mention this morning on the FCA being a pricing regulator. And it does not set prices. It's not a pricing regulator in that sense, but it should have a legitimate interest in making sure that consumers are getting value for money. There's a fair value test under the duty, and I think, to be fair, the FCA is pushing down that route, and I think we're beginning slowly to see that change. If you think about what happened at a year, when the day the duty came into force, the FCA pushed on savings rates. We're now a year and a bit beyond, and I do think they need to keep their eye on that.
Can any consumer see any difference from any of their financial services providers?
I can tell you one thing. Cases going through the FOS, for example, and going back to the consumer the sort of consumer understanding and in particular consumer support angle of the duty. The FOS has picked up that firms aren't doing enough on consumer support, which can be anything from making sure they're answering the phone properly and giving answers to queries, to a sort of much deeper support. The FCA are, I think, picking that up, and I'm hoping that, as Julie says, it takes a while. It's a slow process.
You'd think there'd been really something noticeable by now.
If complaints are going to the FOS is picking this up. Okay. The FOS is reporting on this. Then slowly but surely.
When do you think it failed to go to the Ombudsman? So that doesn't sound very optimistic. Has Which been able to pick up any differences?
No. No. And can I say something? That actually, we decided to look a market where we were seeing a lot of complaints or issues to see how the consumer duty was going to make a change, which is the insurance market. It's a market where we will see the consumer duty making
we'll
a
get
huge
to insurance in a moment.
But you asked me, but you asked me, do you see a change? And in that market, we are not seeing a change.
Do our constituents see any change at all? No.
But the change will come from the specific financial services. I mean, that is how you see a change. You don't see a change.
I just wondered if you'd seen any that you could report to us.
Pick up on the insurance. Pick up on the insurance. That's well documented. Yeah.
I think we're going to come to the insurance in a moment. The other one I wanted to ask about was that last week the FCA reported that 7 million UK consumers have now bought cryptocurrency of some kind. Whose fault is that?
Well, Ms. Charlton,
I think.
The online companies.
It's online. I mean, it's online harm basically, where there's a difficult overlap between one regulator and another. I think this goes back to why are consumers going to take advice on TikTok rather than going to a firm? And what are those behavioural factors?
It's free and it's in their hand.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah,
it's free, presumably.
And if crypto does come on, going back to the boundary and what comes within the FCA, the risk that consumers are taking around crypto, they will have to understand, and firms will have to explain that to them. So
we've seem to have regulated any sort of actual help for consumers into such a space that not enough of them are getting it.
Sorry, can I just add? I honestly believe that even if you change this advice guidance boundary to the degree the industry want, that would not prevent so many millions of people investing in cryptocurrency. That's a different cause and effect, because the same people who are attracted by cryptocurrency are not going to be the people that could be benefited by any supposed reform to the advice guidance boundary review. I mean, I do think it's, again, look, this is an area where there really is a need for good research and analysis, because we're now in the era of embedded finance. There's regulated embedded finance, which will be buy now, pay later. That will be regulated, thankfully. But I mean, it's this intersection between technology and finance is causing the real harm, which I'm afraid regulated financial services itself is unable to protect against.
The consumer duty, you all agree, has not managed to improve things for consumers.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Look, I mean, I think it's absolutely right. It will take some time before we see the outcomes changing. And one of the criticisms we had of the consumer duty is that the FCA hasn't mandated a standard reporting format for firms, so it is going to be difficult to measure the outcomes. Nevertheless, it's actually quite clear that firms have taken action, because the FCA has published a series of reviews of the implementation of the consumer duty, and action is happening. Yeah,
I think it's a fair challenge.
It's a fair challenge.
Dame Harriet's making. Ms. Hunter.
Thank you. I just wanted to make the point about the stages of the progress, because after the publication, we've seen evidence that the FCA is now using the consumer duty in terms of the way it interacts with us, the panel, the way it's having very early contact with us on key, areas of policy. The consumer duty is front of mind, I would say, when teams come to speak to us. The consumer impact is front of mind. So you've got that first, but then you've got whether firms are then embedding it and implementing it. And we know that lots are, but it's very inconsistent, lots aren't. But further down the line is the actual positive impact on consumers' everyday lives, and that's the bit that we haven't seen. So I'd say, to your point, we are seeing evidence that it's having an impact, but we're not at that final stage of the journey yet.
When do you think we'll get there?
Well, we'd like to see it ASAP, obviously.
But also you need to see the regulator taking action to the ones that are not complying with the consumer duty, because otherwise the rest that are complying, they say, why we bother? You need to.
Do you think the FCA is not doing enough of that?
I think that my view is that FCA is not doing enough about that.
Well, can I turn to the work you've done on insurance, and you don't need to detail it because we've been briefed up on and we know what the work that Which did on this. Do you think that the consumer duty will help the FCA in dealing with the concerns around insurance?
If it's properly enforced, absolutely.
And so, and do you think, have you seen any good examples of where it has been enforced that you could cite?
We don't see any examples of enforcement, but we hear that during supervision discussions with firms, the FCA is able to lever the duty to secure an improvement during that supervision process, which stops enforcement and actually secures an improvement earlier.
But can I say something on that? This is again the asymmetric information that we face.
Yes.
So we are being told by the FCA that they are having these discussions when we are talking to the companies and saying to remind them about the duty, but we don't see the evidence. We just have that as a statement.
But specifically with insurance, it's not quite the same as motor finance, but you've got a third party involved, don't you? So you've got the company you buy your insurance with, and then you'll have the loss adjuster or whoever's out to the third party that is part of that process. And a lot of the things that you raised were about that third party.
No, everything.
Yeah, everything. Well, so do you think that the consumer duty will help with that third party when actually the regulated body is not always where sometimes, but not always where the problem is?
Yes, because still the provider of the insurance service is responsible to comply with the consumer duty, absolutely. But it has to be, again, enforced.
And you have any confidence that there will be a step change in this because of the consumer duty?
I hope there will be, but again, I'm talking in hypothetical terms. So the reason, because we wanted to spend a lot of our resources in the insurance market is actually to uncover whether it was making a big difference, and where we have uncovered is a lot of harm and inconsistency with the consumer duty. So what we need to see is the regulator then taking action.
Now, Mr. McAteer, earlier you talked about the stratas of people that they financially excluded, those sort of just about managing, I suppose, to coin a phrase, but there are also people with very definite protected characteristics, some vulnerabilities, learning disabilities, and so on. How well do you all think that the financial services are dealing with this? And I remember one time having a session with a load of regulators, and they all dealt with their vulnerable customers differently and identified them differently. So it's a chance to find out from you what you think the FCA's doing, how the FCA is doing on this to keep firms on point. Mr. McAteer, I started.
Sure. I think this is a really, really interesting challenge because the FCA estimates that 47% of adults have got one characteristic of vulnerability. That's a lot of people, but I have to say, this is just a personal view now, I'm not sure that kind of that number, that estimate helps us identify which people need the most support. I think the new National Financial Inclusion Strategy, which I'm so pleased the government is committed to, I really hope that new strategy focuses on the people who really do need the most support. So, for example, black adults in this country are 2 times more likely to be in financial difficulty. They're twice as likely to have high-cost credit, much more likely to be struggling with day-to-day bills. People in Northern Ireland are much more likely to be in financial difficulty as well than GB. So I just really, really hope the regulators and whoever coordinates the financial inclusion strategy focuses on the most vulnerable groups, because large numbers like that, I think, conceal where the real harm is. And the FCA will now have regard to financial inclusion, thankfully, because of the intervention of the government. That should make a difference, but I really hope it isn't a Trojan horse for more deregulation, because if you listened to the trade bodies today, they were making claims about things like regulation is causing exclusion, regulation is stifling innovation. So I'm really, really pleased there's a strategy, really pleased there's a have regard, but it shouldn't be a Trojan horse for deregulation.
Any quick comments? I'll go down the panel. Helen,
the only thing I would add is that I couldn't agree with you more about the inconsistency between regulators' definition of vulnerability. I think the FCA is doing a good job on focusing on vulnerability and the guidance it's produced. The statistic on vulnerability, that is by reference to people moving in and out of vulnerability, for example, a death or bereavement. So I think, it seems a very high number, but I do think that message is from what I see, is landing with firms, and they are taking it seriously.
On something like bereavement, that's a moment in time. Someone rings up their financial provider. It's a question. Well, they're usually ringing for that reason, so it's quite a moment in time to identify a vulnerability. Are there any other temporary vulnerabilities that you would try?
Mental health.
Mental health.
Because that could be transient, it could be, sporadic.
People might not declare it.
Yeah, and that's also something that's...
People need to be better trained in picking that up.
Yes, definitely. That's one of the things I'd say, that the vulnerability guidance was good, but could be improved. It's being reviewed, and we've submitted significant comments to that. And I think a few of the areas that could be improved is broadening the understanding of vulnerability, that the current guidance doesn't mention any external kind of factors. So I think things like, the pandemic, cost of living crisis, the economy, and actually how financial services firms are behaving themselves are really, really important things that can create or exacerbate vulnerability. So they need to be taken into account. We've also, in reference to your point, we've said that firms should be focusing more on the actual difficulties that someone is facing and how they can support those. It's about disclosure, because people find it very difficult to disclose something like a mental health issue. And firms, staff need to be trained to create an environment where consumers, whether it's online or in person on the phone, feel able to disclose the challenges they're facing and what they need. So although there's that kind of a roughly 50% figure, lots of people within that will feel like they don't need additional support.
But some will. So someone might be ringing up about because their bereavement is related directly, but it could also be indirectly related.
It's about needs. You can be at risk of vulnerability. The 50% is like at risk of vulnerability.
It's quite a challenge for. On the other side of the coin.
Yes.
I'm sure most firms would want to do this, but it's quite challenging to get.
It is a challenge. I've seen an example where there's on a call, there's a monitoring, there's a software which monitors various words on the call, which of course are an indicator to the call handler that there could be a vulnerability on the part of the consumers. So, I think I'm pleased that progress is being made. As Julie says, it's an imperfect world, but I think.
Do you think that financial resilience or lack of it is identified properly by companies as a vulnerability? Is it possible to do that? Data. We'll come back to data perhaps at the end. But you're hovering now.
It's such a big question. It really is. It's such an important question. The thing that strikes us in terms of the work we do is, if you look at buy now, pay later products, 44% of the most frequent users were already over indebted, and
well, indeed, the insurance on some of those products in some of the unnamed shop, which is now closed in my constituency, but where people were encouraged actually often by housing providers to go and buy their furniture.
So it's great that it's going to be regulated. Really, really pleased that this, along with the have regard and the financial inclusion strategy, but over indebtedness really does undermine financial resilience in the long term, because if you're over indebted, you can't afford to save. So there's got to be that kind of holistic thinking.
Yes, and we're definitely talking at different layers. When we think only moments ago we were talking about people with lazy capital to invest, so we're talking at quite opposite ends of the scale here. Rachel, Lake MP.
Thank you. We've been talking a bit about resilience, and one of the vulnerabilities that is outlined for the FCA is about capability. And so where do you think the real responsibility is lying for tackling that vulnerability of capability in terms of financial education and awareness?
Well, I think the FCA does not have a sort of financial education role, going back to what Mick was saying, and I think we have to be aware that its role is to regulate firms and protect consumers. I think there is in the same way that the FCA is saying we must have a candid conversation about the secondary objective and what that means. I think we also need to think really carefully about what the FCA should be doing around that and what it needs, and it should be very clear about the powers that it has, what it can do, and how it uses them. and the convening role that it has elsewhere.
And if it doesn't have that role, where do you think that responsibility should?
Well, there's MAPS. We haven't mentioned. No one has mentioned MAPS today. That is a public body with a public information responsibility. So I think there's
money advice.
Yeah, sorry, beg your pardon. The money advice, the pension service. Yeah.
There's a big crossover between like financial education and the consumer understanding we were talking about, because there's just information that people need being given to them at the right time in a format they can understand. So I'd say the two are quite closely linked. Even though the FCA doesn't have a remit for financial education, firms obviously should be responsible for the quality of information that they're providing to consumers. And when you talk about capability, that's something that hopefully could be picked up through conversations with firms, or it could be something, signposting is another, as you mentioned, for example, to MAPS or relevant firms that can provide that financial sort of education and more detailed information independently.
Thank you.
I just come in there. In reality, to change and to have a step change in the level of financial knowledge and awareness of the poorest in our society is not going to happen immediately. I'm not saying that there aren't things that can be done, and I think we could all find a way of doing that. But doesn't it point to, notwithstanding the point made about not doing enough research in this, I mean, basically, if people are ignorant, never had any exposure to financial choices, and have very little money in the first place, there needs to be surely a emphasis put on finding solutions, pathways and nudges to help to save, no interest loan scheme, things that I hope will be in the financial inclusion strategy. Help to save up to £50 a month for 2 years. The government gives £600 to those that do that. Nobody knows about it. Now, I suppose my question is, from the real issue here is the segmentation which you've mentioned, but don't the FCA have a role in actually proactively asserting some sort of market direction here? I mean, they'd write to dear CEO letters, right? We have dear colleague letters, but dear CEO letters. I mean, isn't there a room here for market actors and yourselves to come together to say, look, how can we find some real solutions for those poorest? Yes, we can, address what Celic and others have been doing about buy now, pay later, but it's also actually proactive solutions. And I'm struggling to understand in this sort of can be somewhat perceived to be adversarial conversation. How do we get to a solution?
We'll take quick comments. We can keep them short.
Sorry.
Look, I mean, I think there are two things I would dearly love to see as part of the financial inclusion strategy, which are small changes which kind of have a big impact. We don't need to reinvent the whole process here. Look, the first thing is workplace payroll savings schemes. In all the years of research I've done in the past 30 years, I don't think I've ever seen such compelling evidence that a particular intervention can change consumer behaviours. A lot of consumers are still very passive, they still need persuasion, and the right intervention by trusted intermediaries like employers can make such a difference. The second one is, why isn't step change and other debt advice charities, why aren't they allowed to refer people to credit union savings accounts as well after they come off their debt repayment plan? That sort of slight amendment to the regulatory activities order, I think, could make a big difference to
Thank you. Ms. Charlton.
That goes straight to my point about facilitating the FCA being clear about what it can do, what the powers it has, and what else it can do around this space. I couldn't agree with that more.
I'd just say really important, I think, for the FCA, it's got lots of valuable information, but it needs to be directing messaging, some of its messaging specifically to a consumer audience. Consumers aren't going to go and have a look at the FCA website, even though there's a consumer section, there's consumer pages there. You need ways for that information to reach consumers in their everyday lives. Well, we've done some research into where people go for advice and help and information, and social media is way up there, and alarmingly highest for things like crypto. Probably because there isn't advice from anywhere else. Can I just use one example? We did some research recently on basic bank accounts, And I can't remember the exact stat, it's around 52% of people who had a basic bank account had to ask for it themselves because it wasn't being proactively promoted to them. They weren't aware of it. It wasn't made visible to them. So although you talk about the FCA role, I think there's also a big role for firms in, helping
direct debit
consumers.
guarantee is often a worry for my constituents.
Yeah, helping consumers to understand what's available to them as well.
I mean, the only thing that we'll add is that there is a room here for pulling together in a way, so the consumer groups, the companies, the regulator, the government, to make sure that we are using and looking at all the channels to address that problem, because it's a complex problem.
We could go on forever, but thank you very much indeed. In summary, we have, I think, had played out in this room in both panels some disagreement between the industry and the consumer side about particularly the secondary objective, and real concern from this panel about how the secondary objective has the potential risk to the primary consumer objective. And this is a tension I think we will hear, or we'll be questioning the FCA about when they appear in front of us next week. And the panel also noted the imbalance between industry and consumer groups, and there's resources for lobbying, and we particularly referred to the reduction in the push payment compensation. I think the other things that I picked up very clearly from you, and particularly you, Ms. Contra, is about use of data and targeted research. Ms. Hunter, you mentioned it as well, and the language that is used so that there's consistency in language, and I think they're interesting areas for us to pursue with the Financial Conduct Authority next week. But can I thank you very much indeed for your time. Order.
Thank you.
Order.